Hi, everyone. In today's lecture, we will discuss pedigree analysis. Meanwhile, we will go through several genetic diseases and practice some questions together. Pedigree is probably not unfamiliar to many of you. It basically is a diagram illustrating the members and ancestry relationships in a family. The purpose is to show the inheritance of a trait and to estimate the risk of any given family member inheriting that trait. So is pedigree showing a phenotype or genotype? In the definition, it says trait, so it is a phenotype. But can pedigree analysis reveal genotype information? Yes, it is possible. In fact, using pedigree to predict the genotypes shows up very often in genetics exams. This picture showing here is a very typical graph about a pedigree. Let's see what these symbols mean next. In order to understand the pedigree, you need to understand the numbering system used in pedigrees. Each generation is identified by Roman numeral. The pedigree only shows 2 generations, 1 and 2, and the square stands for males, and the circles stands for females. Here in generation 1, a male and a female mated, and they had 3 children in generation 2, 2 daughters shown in the circle, and 1 son shown in the square. Each individual within a generation is identified by an Arabic number 1, 2, or 3. Here, the son is filled with black color, which indicates that this individual is affected by a genetic disorder or showing a specific trait. There is a P letter pointing to this person, meaning this is a proband, the first affected family member who was identified with his trait. There are many symbols being used in pedigree construction. Here shows the common used ones. Previously, I asked my students to remember all these symbols. This semester, since we are doing open book exam, I hope you all should at least get familiar with what all these symbols mean. And I will not go through these one by one. You can see that some of the symbols already have the genotype information, such as the non-heterozygous and like a carrier of X-linked recessive trait. And I'll go through what they stand for in this lecture. This is a pedigree showing the inheritance of a trait through several generations of a family. What kind of information can you get from this pedigree? You can pause here to look and think. My understanding is that mating between relatives is really bad. There are 2 examples. In generation 3, individual 4 and 5, they mated and give birth to 6 children. The parents were consanguineous because their own parents were siblings. Although this couple did not show any symptoms, and 3 out of 6 children were affected by this disease. In contrast, in generation 3, individual 7, this person was affected, but his wife was not his relative, and all 4 children did not show any symptom. Also, you can see this is an autosomal recessive inherited trait, and you might tell who are the heterozygous or carriers for this trait. You really can find quite some information from a pedigree analysis. If we make a summary, a pedigree analysis can reveal the dominant or recessive inheritance pattern of a trait, and sometimes even the chromosome locus of the gene in question. I will show you some examples later. Most importantly, it can be used to predict the risk of inheriting a specific trait, particularly for the future kids or aging-related diseases. That means if you learn these human genetic courses really well, you could be a fortune teller when you have the right tools. Now I would like to discuss what kind of genetic diseases can be studied using pedigree as the tool. We will introduce these diseases by the order shown on this slide. Autosomal recessive, autosomal dominant, X-linked dominant, X-linked recessive, and Y-linked traits. There are two concepts here. One, autosomes and sex chromosomes. We know that X and Y chromosomes are sex chromosomes, and an autosome is any chromosome that is not a sex chromosome. So how many autosomes do human beings have? Yes, 44. How many pairs of autosomes? It's 22. That's right. So second is the dominant or recessive. We learned that this from last lecture. Any trait shown in heterozygous is dominant trait, right? So see the picture on the right. You can see that a heterozygous flower is purple, indicating the heterozygous, the dominant trait is also a purple, right? So the recessive trait here is white, which only shows up when homozygous alleles are recessive. I was trying to provide you with some examples of human traits that is only determined by a single gene. But after more searching, I found that many classical examples shown in textbooks, such as like rolling tongues or detached ears and hairlines, are not controlled by alleles of a single gene. But the appearance of earwax is actually a good example and exactly follows Mendelian inheritance. Two types of earwax can be found, wet or dry, right? And shown here is a picture of their appearance. This is wet, this is dry. Wet is the dominant trait, and dry is the recessive trait. Interestingly, scientists already found the genes that control the phenotypes. The gene name is ATCC11. So by nucleotide comparison, you can see that there is only one nucleotide difference between these two alleles. This, do you still remember what the difference is called? Yes, it's SMP, stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. Due to this SMP, this ATCC11 protein will have two forms. One contains this glycine, and one contains this arginine. The side chain of the arginine, we know that's positively charged, which may cause a different folding of the ATCC11 protein. Therefore, the two forms of ATCC11 protein may have different functions and result in different appearance of earwax. Now let's discuss genetic disorders that follow different patterns. First, let's see disorders with autosome recessive pattern. Autosome means the disease is caused by mutations on autosomes, and the recessive means two mutant alleles are needed to show the phenotype of this disease. Remember, if the disease is autosomal, then it is expressed equally in both males and females. We'll go through these details using a disease called cystic fibrosis as an example. Here list the examples of autosomal recessive disorders, and the majority of them will be included in the list of genetic diseases for your group project. So, but we only talk about cystic fibrosis in our class, shown here. Cystic fibrosis is a fetal recessive genetic disorder associated with abnormal secretion of the exocrine glands, such as sweat glands and salivary glands. A gene named CFTR, so it's responsible for the onset of this disease. A normal CFTR gene encodes the production of a chloride membrane channel protein, which is involved in secretion of sweat, mucus, and digestive juices. If the CFTR gene has mutations, it may produce a non-functional membrane protein, leading to sticky mucus building up in the organs such as the lungs. Cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive disorder, meaning cystic fibrosis occurs only when both alleles are mutated. Okay, in this picture, we will use letter O to represent a normal allele of a CFTR gene and a letter M to represent a mutated allele of CFTR gene. The mother and the father both have one normal allele and one mutated allele, indicating they are both are heterozygous, also called carriers. They can have the following offsprings. Okay, so one is MM, both mutated. Two of them are heterozygous, just like the parents have one normal allele, one mutated allele, and another child could be an OO, both are normal allele. These are genotype or phenotype. Yes, that's genotype. Then how about their phenotype? Okay, so we know that recessive, so it's OM and OO, they appears to be normal, and only MM, recessive homozygous, it shows the disease. Okay, so whether you show this disease or not, that is the phenotype. The incidence of cystic fibrosis is not super high. It occurs probably in 1 in 2,500 to 3,500 white newborns. But the incidence of carriers, meaning the heterozygous, is quite frequent. It occurs in 25 Americans of European descent, 1 in 46 Hispanics, 1 in 60 African Americans, and 1 in 150 Asian Americans. There are other disorders that are inherited as autosomal dominant. The key point about autosomal dominant inheritance is that a heterozygous allele expresses the abnormal phenotype, and every affected individual has at least one affected parent. Since this is autosomal inherited, this kind of disease is present equally in males and females. Let's take a look at how this type of diseases are inherited in the next slide. So we keep using the letter M as the mutated allele, okay? So, and O as the normal allele. So the dominant inheritance suggests that as long as one allele has a mutation, this person will show a disease phenotype. The MO and the OO parents generate 50% disease and 50% normal offsprings. As we mentioned, there's no difference between males and females. As long as you have one mutated here, you show as a disease. The inheritance of autosomal dominant traits can be shown in this category. Will you be able to tell how the disease is inherited by analyzing this category? This category shows many of the characteristics of autosomal dominant inheritance. First, affected individuals have at least one affected parent, and about 1/2 of the children who have one affected parents are affected. This is the case. Also, both sexes have affected with roughly equal frequency, and affected parents can have unaffected children. All these are features of autosomal dominant traits. This table lists some examples of autosomal dominant disorders. We were focused on one disorder named Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome is a genetic disorder that affects the connective tissue, all right? It occurs 1 in about 10,000 individuals, and a quarter of the diseases have no familiar history, indicating a high mutation rate is associated with this disorder. Marfan syndrome is caused by mutations in the fibrillin that is encoded by this FBN1 gene. Fibrillin is a glycoprotein and essential for the proper formation of the extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix is critical for both the structural integrity of connective tissues, but also serves as a reservoir for growth factors. Marfan syndrome affects the skeletal system, cardiovascular system, heart, and eyes, and the affected individuals are usually tall and thin, with long arms and legs and thin fingers. So this picture shows a positive wrist sign of a person with Marfan syndrome, and the thumbs and the little fingers, they can overlap when grasping the wrist. And you can try yours, whether, you know, I have a long distance between my thumb and a little finger. A well-known case of Marfan syndrome, the girl is called Flo Heyman. So she was a 6 foot 5 inch star on the US women's volleyball team that won a silver medal in the 1984 Olympics. But unfortunately, 2 years later, at the age of 31, she died in a volleyball game from a ruptured aorta caused by Marfan syndrome. How Marfan syndrome affects aorta? This picture shows a heart and its major blood vessels. Oxygen-rich blood is pumped from the lung to the left side of the heart. From there, blood is pumped through the aorta to all parts of our body. In Marfan syndrome, these FBN1 mutations cause defective connective tissue and cause the base of the aorta to enlarge, and potentially it can be ruptured, leading to the death. Okay, now let's discuss sex-linked inheritance. Before that, let's quickly go over the sex chromosomes. We all know that female carries 2 X chromosomes, and males carry only 1 X chromosome, but there's a 1 Y chromosome. The picture here is a scanning electron micrograph of X and Y chromosomes. You can see that X chromosome is a lot bigger than Y chromosomes. Actually, most genes on the X chromosome are not found on the Y chromosome. This gives rise to unique patterns of inheritance for genes on the X and the Y chromosomes. This slide is a reminder on how the sex chromosomes determine the sex of the child. All children receive an X chromosome from their mothers. Fathers pass the X chromosome to all their daughters and the Y chromosome to all of their sons. X-linked trait is a trait where a gene is located on the X chromosome. All right, so because females have 2 X chromosomes, females can be heterozygous or homozygous. However, males only have 1 X chromosome. So if the males have the X-linked trait, it's hard to define as heterozygous or homozygous, right? So it's called a hemizygous. First, let's introduce the X-linked dominant inheritance pattern. We need to discuss two scenarios, as the X-linked mutations can be carried either by a father or a mother. To analyze the sex chromosome-linked inheritance, we can use letter X and Y to differentiate from autosomal inheritance. If the mutation occurs in X chromosome, we can label it as XM. Shown on the left, if the father carries the X-linked mutation, the affected father is hemizygous. The father's X chromosome can only be passed to his daughters, but not his sons. Because the phenotype is dominant, any individual carries this mutation will show the disorder. All right. So on the right, there shows the mutated X chromosome in females. The affected mother is a heterozygous and can pass the mutated X to both the sons and her daughter. But then this is equal chance. In both cases, because only one chromosome is affected, the chance of affected children to unaffected children is 50-50. This is a pedigree for an X-linked dominant trait. There are several features about this inheritance pattern. So affected males produce all affected daughters and no affected sons. Affected females transmit the trait to roughly half their children, with males and females equally affected. And overall, twice as many females as males are affected with the trait. In contrast to X-linked dominant traits, there are a lot more traits inherited in a recessive manner. Because females have two X chromosomes, only homozygous recessive females are affected, but not heterozygous females, right? Males are different. Males only have one X chromosome. Therefore, hemizygous males are affected, meaning they express the recessive phenotype. Due to this reason, the X-linked recessive traits are more commonly seen in males, and affected males pass the affected allele to all of their daughters, but none of their sons. Let's see next slide to understand the inheritance a little bit better. This diagram shows how X-linked recessive trait is inherited. Again, we show affected father and affected mother separately. So if the father carries an X chromosome linked mutation as a hemizygous, the father will show an affected phenotype. All right. So his X chromosome and Y chromosome are separated during meiosis. The X chromosome is always inherited to daughters, and Y chromosome is always inherited to sons. As a consequence, all of his sons will be normal, and all his daughters are heterozygous. Because this is a recessive trait, right? So all his daughters are carriers, but not showing the recessive trait. But how about if the mother carries one mutated X chromosome, showing on the right? The mutated X chromosome can have equal chance to pass to the children. However, the daughter with the mutated X chromosome become a carrier, and the hemizygous son become affected. This slide shows a pedigree of an X-linked recessive trait. This is easy to tell because the circle with a black dot showing here indicates a carrier of X-linked recessive trait. Based on our analysis, this pedigree shows the characteristics of X-linked recessive traits. First, hemizygous males are affected and transmit this trait to all of their daughters, who become heterozygous carriers. And 2, phenotype expression is much more common in males than in females. This table shows some excellent recessive traits. I'll focus on color blindness to introduce a little bit more. Color blindness is a defective color vision caused by reduction or absence of visual pigments. People who are color blinded see colors differently. It has 3 forms: red, green, and blue blindness. There are approximately 8% of the male population in the United States that are affected by color blindness. That means 1 out of 12 males are affected. For women, the number is 0.5%, right? So the pictures here show that those with normal vision see the red leaves, but then for someone who is red or green color blindness, they will see the leaves as gray. When you were young, you probably had seen all these circled pictures to test if you are color blindness or not. So this picture is just one of them. People with normal color vision see the number 20, this is number 15 in the chart. However, those who are color blinded cannot see this number. But what causes color blindness? In the retina, there are 2 types of light receptor cells. We name them as photoreceptor cells. The rods are sensitive to difference of light intensity, and the cones are sensitive to differences in color. There are 3 types of cones: the red sensitive, the blue sensitive, and the green sensitive. When the cones have all the various pigments called photopigments, your eyes see all possible colors. But if there's a problem with the pigment, so you won't see colors the way you should. This is called a color deficiency or color blindness. Next, we will talk about the Y chromosome linked inheritance. Because only males have Y chromosome, Y-linked inheritance is restricted to males, and the mutated Y chromosome is passed directly from father to son. They are always hemizygous and affected by the mutated trait. Up to now, there are about 60 Y-linked traits have been identified, and many of them are involved in male sexual development. But why is that? Because most male sexual development genes are located on Y chromosome. So you can see Y-linked inheritance is rather simple here. Only fathers and sons can be affected, and all the sons of an affected father are affected. So this is a pedigree for a Y-linked trait. These traits are transmitted from males to all male offspring in each generation. Pretty easy. Okay, now let's practice a few questions together. So here is one. If a father has a Y chromosome linked disease, what is the chance of his son getting this disease? How about his daughter? This is easy, right? So we just talked about it. So the son is 100% and the daughter is 0%. Then how about this one? If a father has an X-linked dominant disease, what is the chance of his son getting this disease? How about his daughter? So assuming the mother is a healthy female, so you can pause here and think. I want to practice this first, okay? When you have an answer, then continue. The keywords in this question are X-linked and dominant, all right? Based on this question, we know that the father is XMY and the mother is XX. So if they have a son, the father contributes a Y the mother contributes X, then the mutated allele will not be inherited in son, right? So the chance is 0%. But on the other hand, if the couple have a daughter, the father has to contribute his mutated X chromosome. Then the chance of his daughter getting this disease is 100%. If you consider this is a dominant inheritance. Okay, so now we change the question a little bit. If this is a recessive disease, all other conditions remain the same, what will be the answer? Yes, the genetic analysis are all the same. The only difference is the phenotype. The son still have a 0% of a chance, but the daughter now has 100% chance to become heterozygous, right? So because this is a recessive inheritance, the daughter is a carrier but not affected by this disease. Have you got all this correct? Lastly, I will briefly introduce the mitochondrial inheritance. Why mitochondrial phenotype can be inherited? This is because mitochondria also have DNA that can encode the proteins. Most of these proteins are related to mitochondrial function, and the genetic disorder in mitochondrial DNA are associated with defects in energy conversion. As we learned before, mitochondrial DNA are maternally inherited. Therefore, the inheritance of mitochondrial traits are maternally inherited. This is a typical pedigree showing the pattern of inheritance associated with mitochondrial genes. Both males and females can be affected by mitochondrial disorders, but only females can transmit the traits to their children and all her children. Okay, so this is the last slide. It lists the several mitochondrial disorders. We will not get into detail to these disorders. Okay, that's all for today. Enjoy.